From the plains to the rolling hills, Oklahoma is a state that resonates with stories of resilience, determination, and pride. Welcome to Inside the 1581, a podcast of the Oklahoma Hospital Association. Together, we'll dive deep into the heartbeat of the great state of Oklahoma as we journey through the rich history, diverse culture, and the ever-evolving landscape within the 1,581 miles of border in our nation's 20th largest state. Each episode of Inside the 1581 will feature conversations with the many voices which help shape our state's future and our shared vision of improving health and healthcare in Oklahoma.
Welcome to this edition of Inside the 1581. I'm Rich Rasmussen, President and CEO of the Oklahoma Hospital Association. And today we're just delighted to spend some time with Gene Rainbolt, who is the founder of BancFirst. But more importantly, he has become an icon here in Oklahoma. Gene is 95 years young, born and raised in Norman, Oklahoma. And we're going to get into our conversation with Gene. But Gene, I just want to take a moment and read something here. This is a foreword that came from the book that you provided the foreword to called Oklahoma Pride. I think this really captures the sense of who you are, and I think your vision for our state. And so I'm going to read this foreword for folks. It says, "I treasure my Oklahoma heritage and speak with gratitude about Oklahoma roots. I care about the people of Oklahoma. I have lived long enough to witness the struggles. Living through the Great Depression impacted me deeply. Many farmers lost their livelihoods, and I saw the effects of the Dust Bowl, or the Dust Bowl landscape, so powerfully described in The Grapes of Wrath. I understood the lyrics written by Woody Guthrie in his song Tom Joad. Wherever little children are hungry and cry, wherever people ain't free, wherever men are fighting for their rights, and that's where I'm going to be. I identified myself with the mythical cousin of Tom Joad. And so throughout my life, I have seen a vacuum created by the absence of emboldened leadership and public support. For me, it is simple. It is about mobilizing actions at the community and state levels to nurture those who call Oklahoma home. Oklahoma Pride, working together for the well-being of all Oklahomans, is my love letter to the state, imploring us to take the needed actions to improve the lives of our residents. I ask you to join me in this action." What a letter to open a book which really helped to identify, what are the challenges that we have in this great state with 1,581 miles of border. And so, Gene, I'm just delighted to have you here to have a conversation about what you've seen in your life and your vision for our state moving forward. And so the biggest question I want to ask you is, you look great at 95 years young. How do you stay in such great shape?
I think there are three bases. One, I have good genes. Mm-hmm. And secondly, I think it's equally important, I've had good doctors. And thirdly, I've treated my body with respect.
Those are good lessons for all of us. Absolutely good lessons. And so you, in what I've read about you and in some similar interviews that you've had, you spoke a lot about growing up during the Depression. My mom was born in 1929, and so she's often had told stories about that. You've done it in very vivid descriptions of what it was like and what you saw here in Oklahoma. Tell us a little bit about your childhood and how that helped shape who you are.
Well, I obviously am a product of the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl. And in those years, the rural Oklahoma, in which most of my relatives lived, had no water, no electricity, very little access to health care or any of the things that made life easier. And the Dust Bowl compounded that for the least financially capable. And living in Norman, I was very fortunate because of the university being there. But I recall that people would routinely come by knocking on our door asking for food. My father was in the wholesale grocery business. and I would go with him to call on the civilian conservation corps camps where hundreds of young men had come from around the state to work for $25 a month to send home and to work on public works, or WPA doing projects everywhere, 25% of the people being unemployed. So it was a time of obvious disaster and without many solutions in Oklahoma and without much political leadership either.
And so you're seeing this, and obviously it probably shaped your intention to go to school, to look for an opportunity to have your impact. Now, you went to the University of Oklahoma, correct?
My family lived in Norman because they wanted their children to go to the university. So, yes, I went to the University of Oklahoma.
And what did you study when you were there?
Economics and finance. Did my master's degree, and my thesis in those years, a master's thesis was equivalent to a PhD in today's world, but it was the economics of aid to dependent children program, which focused again on those who had the least. And I had open access to all the records because there was no such thing as privacy.
Right.
And the sad thing, if I went back to those same families, same names today, I would find that probably 90% of the families are still in the same cycle of poverty they were in the 1930s.
And that is something that we tend to see, that if we don't show a pathway or create a pathway for somebody to get out of poverty, they tend to stay in poverty, and so do their dependents.
Well, what I discovered was that 1 out of 10 could escape in a family, but typically it was because some outside influence that they encountered. And there are too few outside influences helping those families.
So you saw this. You went to school. You graduated. What did you do next? What started your journey into your professional career?
Well, I'm not sure why did I do a study in the Aid to Dependent Children program, because it was obviously one of Oklahoma's biggest problems is how do we create opportunity for all of our young people? And that was the attitude in the years I was growing up. The Woody Guthries from Okemah, Oklahoma.
And so with all of that, what do you see as the reason why during that period Oklahoma seemed to just settle into this poverty environment as opposed to advancing as rapidly as perhaps some of the other states with so many natural resources that we have here?
Well, I think we were blessed and damned by resources because we're have been historically totally dependent on oil and gas. And if you look at the statistics, our per capita income is absolutely tied and continues to this day to be so to the price of oil. And being a commodity producing state, our country, is a very poor way to make a living.
And so you saw this, and then you started this internal journey to find a way through banking and a financing career. What brought you into that? And tell us a little bit. I know you had some real major impacts in modernizing the laws in our state as it relates to banking. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, it's very accidental that I am in the banking. Spent 65 years in the banking industry, but I immediately went to the military after college. Stayed overseas for 3 years because I wanted to grow and see more of the world. But when it came time for me to start a career, I said, I want to go back to Oklahoma, even though I had a job offer in New York. And I had no idea what I would do in Oklahoma. So in visiting with my chair of my master's thesis, he said, I've been on the board of this little bank, and the man who owns it needs someone to come and run it because he's ill. Let me introduce you. And he did, and I was well aware of the impact that banking had because of being a finance major, and I could see that would open the door for me to be a major influence in a particular community and ultimately a state. And within 15 minutes of his introduction to the owner of the bank, I had a new job and I was a banker.
Very good. And what year would that be?
1959.
1959. So you had a point where we've come out of the creation of FDIC. We've matured over a decade or two, and now you're coming into a state that probably had some archaic banking laws that needed to be changed in order to allow the state to prosper.
Well, not just archaic, incredibly restrictive.
Okay.
Mississippi and Oklahoma had the most restrictive banking laws in the country, and the rural legislators had no inclination to change them because their local banker was fearful of competition. And so we worked for 30 years to change the banking laws, modernize them like the rest of the country. And had we not had the oil collapse in 1980, which again was many years after I commenced my efforts, I'm not sure that we would have succeeded even then. But we had 125 banks fail, and suddenly everyone said, oh, we've got to do something. So we were able to finally modernize Oklahoma's banking laws, and it was 1989 before we were able to be structured the same as banking in the rest of the country.
And how do you see the work that you've done in the banking community certainly ensure that local communities have local bank ownership as opposed to the big regional banks, the big national banks? How important do you think that is to having state banks and lenders in your community that live in your community?
Well, I think it's important, and it's important to our bank because that's the basis on which we're organized. By the same token, I don't think that it's logical to think that a Chase or a Bank of America will be in these smaller communities. So I think it's important to have a state banking organization that focused on the smaller communities and small business.
And that's very similar with hospitals too. You have the small community-based hospitals, whether you're a critical access hospital, a very small hospital, or even some of our larger non-metro hospitals. It's very same in terms of having that local governance, that local leadership, folks that you grow up trusting because they've always been there and they've always supported you, much like a local bank.
Well, again, I hypothesized that at the peak we had 550 banks in Oklahoma. We currently have less than 200, and ultimately probably will have no more than 25 or 30. That does not suggest there won't be branches, however,
right,
with banks that have substantial capital and trained personnel in the smaller communities.
Now, if you look back in your banking career, how would you describe your greatest success as you look back? Maybe not it necessarily has to be in the banking field, but you as a leader in our state, if you looked at it, what are you most proud of in terms of being a leader in our state?
Well, I'm most proud of the fact that BancFirst has the culture it does, its dedication to employees, its dedication to its communities, and its dedication to the state. So the culture of BancFirst is my proudest accomplishment.
Now, who's leading? Are you? What level of leadership are you still providing to the bank today, or is it? And who have you passed that baton on, if you have?
My son became the chief executive officer 32 years ago, which enabled me to focus on the non-banking things in the state that I was interested in. And he shares with me just as much commitment to the future of Oklahoma as I've ever had.
Does he ever pick up the phone and say, "Hey, Dad, I got a question. What do you think about this?" How often do those?
No, he doesn't. He says, "Dad, this is what I think we should do."
Okay. Well, then you've trained him well.
He's a strategist, whereas I'm a tactician.
Okay. Very good. So tell me about you. So you went into this work trying to change state law And so you've worked with real icons in government and public policy in this state. What was it like in the early years when you were trying to advance this? What did you learn in that experience of becoming, an advocate for improving the banking environment?
That we had very short-sighted, very uninformed, very prejudiced legislators.
And it took you a while to convince them.
Well, again, I'm not sure it took the collapse of the state to convince them.
And you've seen what you learned in that. Obviously, you have translated that into other work and other passions that you have to be able to advance our state. What are some of those that you've spent some time in? It's clearly the beginning, the opening to Oklahoma Pride. You kind of tease out some of the work that we have to do as a state. What were some things that you did to dial down on the relationships that you created?
Well, I think that you're using the word "did." That's past tense.
Okay.
And the fact is, we didn't do much. I'm still disgusted with the progress. We talk about top 10. Well, you don't get in the top 10 till you get out of the bottom 10. And I think you have to accept where you are before you can strategize to what you might become. And Oklahoma's totally failed in that effort. So I think what's more important is what we might do.
Well, that's a really great question, Gene. And when we look at our state, and we talk about it all the time, even at our board level and among our team members here, is that we rank 47th nationally in our health performance. In other words, there are 46 other states that do it better than us. And oftentimes we say, thank goodness for Mississippi, right? Well,
we say that frequently.
We do, and we shouldn't. And so how do we lean into our future?
I think we're at the point of change over the next 5 years. Why do I say that? Well, we have to redistrict with the census of 2030. And the population has shifted from 70% rural to 70% in the metropolitan areas. Witness Medicaid expansion. The rural areas vote against it, even though they're beneficiaries. And the metropolitan areas voted for it because they are better educated and have more economic opportunity. So I think the 2030 census, if we will pass the right legislation, and I think it will come through initiative, petition, not through legislative effort, we can convert Oklahoma to a forward-looking state.
Well, Gene, we're going to take a break here. When we come back, we're going to pick that tone there. We're going to talk a little bit more about the future and what we can do as a state to get to a better place. And I know it's something you've talked about: healthcare, education, addressing issues of poverty. But we're going to talk about those when we come back to this edition of Inside the 1581. But first, we're going to hear a message from our partners at PYA.
No two hospitals are alike. PYA's Overwatch lets you choose the exact level of support you need without paying for the services you don't. From compliance, IT, revenue, audit, and real estate, your Overwatch is built for you. Learn more at pyapc.com.
Welcome back to this edition of Inside the 1581. And again, we're here with Gene Rainbolt. And I just want to quote something here, Gene, and we'll pick up on our conversation. It said, you were selected as one of the 50 most powerful Oklahomans in 2006 and named Oklahoma City County Historical Society Pathmaker in 2004. So even you mentioned earlier you had retired and handed the strings over to your son. You've not let anything slow you down in terms of handing off the day-to-day operations of the bank, and you continued to double down on your engagement in our state. And so as we pick up our conversation, we were talking a little bit about the future of Oklahoma, and you were about to share something with me before we came back.
Yes, we were talking about why haven't Oklahomans been more proactive in change? And the former president of Oklahoma Baptist University, who became the president of Wake Forest because his views were a bit progressive for Oklahoma, James Ralph Scales, and Danny Morgan, a historian, jointly wrote a book, The History of Politics in Oklahoma. And they hypothesized, and I think it's very accurate, that Oklahomans who came here were so poor they could not afford to risk any change. So instead of trying to change things, they held on to just being able to survive.
And that's probably, we could probably look at modern examples of that, particularly for single parents, particularly single moms who are afraid to take some professional risk in maybe changing jobs or something like that because everything they have is what's right in front of them.
Well, I think it captures the essence of poverty. And if you look at the book Oklahoma Pride, we're last in all the things that make any difference. Education, incarceration, poverty, health care, incarceration, teenage pregnancy, everything. We're right at the bottom.
Oh, it's clear. I mean, if you look at the book, I mean, each chapter has a whole different story to tell.
Yes.
You touched on early tobacco, certainly poverty. It's all in here. And for our listeners, certainly it's something worth purchasing, sharing with others after you've had a chance to read it, and then make sure you get it back so it becomes a desk reference because it's chock full of great information in there. So you have a history. We kind of talked about a little bit with the Cancer Center at OU. Tell us a little bit about how that came about and your role in helping to bring that to a reality in our state.
Well, I have been a very committed supporter of the Health Sciences Center always because it's a major need, and also it's an incredibly important economic part of Oklahoma City. And so I was involved with Oklahoma medical research beginning in the 60s or 70s, and at the same parallel with the medical center. And so I was just always part of what their planning was, and they said, we need to have a cancer center. So we hired a national consultant to study what is the possibility, what's the need. And they gave us an outline, and over a period of years, we simply followed their outline. And because of, again, the tobacco settlement funds and some very generous donors like Charles and Peggy Stevenson, we were able to found the Stevenson Cancer Center, and with the research dollars from the Tobacco Settlement Trust, hire the researchers necessary to become a National Cancer Institute.
Which is an incredible gift to give to the
Well, it's one of
people of the state.
Oklahoma's few really outstanding accomplishments. But again, it establishes the point, with the resources, Oklahomans are as good as the best.
Oh, absolutely. When I, having been raised in Central Florida, and, I look at Oklahoma City and I look at Orlando, and I see Oklahoma City as Orlando, 15 years ago. There's incredible promise in here. And it gets back to that whole question you started on earlier about the growth of our metro communities and what that means in economic development that spins off from each one of these metro areas. And I look at our hospitals. If you took out the influence that the oil industry might have in terms of their corporate representation or operations here, really one of the biggest economic engines is healthcare.
And it will be more so in the future.
Absolutely, as we continue to age, for sure. I mean, it is amazing how much impact. We have a study that we're going to be releasing here probably in the next several weeks, which clearly shows that hospitals are the largest employer group in our state. And in terms of dollars that are retained in our state, we are the largest generator of income that remains in our state, which tells us a lot about the impact that healthcare has.
But for much, much greater long-term impact.
Oh, absolutely.
OU, OSU, the quality of research they're doing has increased so much, we're becoming competitive on a national basis. That brings opportunity to Oklahoma we've never dreamed of before.
Oh, clearly. clearly. And we talk about the impact of healthcare. Certainly, we would be in a very different position had we not passed Medicaid expansion. And my understanding, from what I've learned, that you played a role in helping to advance that conversation. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I'm just a real believer in the constitutional right of Oklahomans to substitute their popular vote for the legislature when the legislature fails to deal with problems. And we had a group gather signatures under the constitutional right to have initiative petition to call a vote of the people. And fortunately, the metropolitan areas prevailed and it passed. But the same legislation is available to us to change the things that the legislature refuses to deal with. It is that hope and belief that I think in the next 5 years, with the 2030 census, if we pass the right initiative petitions, we can change Oklahoma.
You know, we talk about, and I don't disagree, you know, coming from a state certainly that had petition, the ability to do that. You know, the challenge is Florida went through this. They went ahead and upped it to 60% of the vote, which I think is detrimental to democracy as we know of it, that, you know, everyone should have the opportunity to change that constitution. So hopefully we will get to a better place here.
Well, we will resist the change.
Which could be good if we resist the change of going to a higher threshold.
I think we
Certainly.
will.
Yeah. But so let's get back to the Medicaid expansion question. Why do you think that some of our smaller communities, which clearly the people in their counties benefit from expansion, why do you think they, you know, would not have supported or voted to support what is in the best interest of their families, their communities, and their rural hospital?
Well, I come back again to James Rouse Scale and Danny Morgan. They're afraid of any change at all. But there are statistics beyond that. The people in the rural areas, and it's very demonstrable, they are poorer, they are less well educated, and they are much older than the metropolitan population.
So that being the case, what do you think would be the role of business leaders in these smaller communities to help educate their local residents about the values of things like this? You know, let's think of the banking community. If we know we can sustain that local rural hospital, that means we keep high-paying jobs in our community. How do we crack the nut on that of having those deeper conversations with business leaders?
Well, I think we have to begin with the reality. Oklahoma has 500 communities with less than 1,000 people. Those communities over the long run are not going to have hospitals. They are not going to survive. They are going away by and large. Many have already gone away. There are, west of I-35, there are 6 communities that probably have enough population to have a hospital, a retail core, and an educational system that will attract people for living around those communities. I think that we have to accept the reality of the population. Eastern Oklahoma has many more people and a larger number of viable communities. But I think we have to recognize the fact that we're still in transition from a very rural state to a more metropolitan state, and it will not be the same as it has been.
Well, and that does create certainly opportunities to educate, you know, who the folks that remain left in those communities that are losing population.
Well, let's focus on where the opportunity is.
Okay.
i.e. those communities that can provide the support for the surrounding communities.
So in that sense, you know, calling on, let's use hospitals as an example, calling on hospitals that have the ability to support these smaller communities or to extend their reach into those smaller communities.
Absolutely. For example, in Lawton, the ability to support a clinic perhaps with nurse practitioners. I don't know our PAs in Frederick, where the hospital's closed.
And they're getting ready to restart the hospital in Frederick, which is a great thing for that community.
But our Enid and the little communities around it, having outreach clinics that can be supported by their hospitals.
Well, and I think that is where everyone is focusing. How do we strengthen the system and the fabric of care that we have in our state?
Yes, let's focus on what's logical.
Absolutely. So let's talk about one item. You were a patient with COVID, and you were, like, from what I've heard from others around the community, you're like one of the first well-known COVID patients. Tell us about that experience.
Well, I had COVID before we knew what COVID was.
Okay.
And what I remember most succinctly is a point when I was most critical of, do I take another breath or do I not? And I decided, well, no, take another breath. And your grandchildren, you need to know them as they grow up. And I'm very happy I did. But the medical system served me incredibly well in a very difficult time.
And so part of one of the challenges that we had going through COVID was clearly ensuring that folks had enough education about the value of the vaccination, and certainly the hard work that caregivers were delivering on that. Education seems to be a theme that we see in so many different challenges that we have in society. You've spoken about the importance of investing in education. If you look at our school system in our state, where do you think the greatest promise lies in trying to continue to improve our school system?
I wish I had the answer to that. And I meet with people from all over the country looking for that answer. Certainly, and it's too easy to say, but attracting and paying teachers is certainly very, very important. And the quality of education of our teachers, so very important. But I'm not sure what the answer is. I look for it every day.
So as a business leader, would you say that healthcare and education are really the two central foundations that as business leaders we should be speaking the loudest about in terms of how to strengthen and support those systems that drive economic growth in our communities?
Well, I have three areas that I think are very related. Education first, because education really begins at conception. And if a child in the early years does not get the love and the nutrition and the preparation for going to school, they will never succeed. So I view education as being first. Second is health care, because and health care includes nutrition and proper diet. And thirdly, I think incarceration is very important, because we know that 70% of the children of incarcerated parents will themselves end up being incarcerated. We have 120,000 or so children in the public school system whose parents are incarcerated. If our statistic continues, that means we are warehousing 100,000 children we're going to put in prison.
And there's an incredible expense for that.
It's not only an incredible expense, it ignores the loss of human behavior and human capacity.
And so that is one of the issues that certainly you spoke about, or was spoken about in Oklahoma Pride. And so if you look at the influence that you have had and the influence you still weld with your colleagues, what would you be telling other business leaders of what their role is, whether it's in advocacy on behalf of improving the lives of people in Oklahoma, or in their own philanthropy? What would you be telling them? You teased a little bit. You came and spoke to our Sunday school class, and you teased a little bit about how you've challenged your business colleagues. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, it's, for every one of us, for years and years, I looked for, and we talked about in terms of education, for a universal solution. I'm convinced now there is no universal solution, that our solution rests with each one of us. And it may be one person at a time, but our entire population needs to be improved or needs to be committed to the improvement of society in our state. We will all be the beneficiaries.
And that is something that I think we lose sight of, that collective will of everyone coming together to be able to do that.
Well, the greater the economy, the greater each one of us individually and collectively will do. The healthcare system, the educational system, for every 1% of our population that has a bachelor's degree, our per capita income goes up by $1,500. Kansas has 10% more of its population with bachelor's degree than we do. So they have $15,000 a year more income per person. What does that mean? If we had $15,000 per year in Oklahoma with 4 million population, that'd be $60 million in gross state product. What a change that would make in all of our institutions.
Oh, absolutely. That whole value of investing in our human capital.
Yes.
Clearly. You're 95 years young, and
I don't like 95 years young. I'm 95 years old.
Okay.
And what I like is I don't live one day beyond that day that I have purpose to live.
And so purpose is really important.
Purpose is so very important.
And you said that you told me that your purpose was to address the initiative in our state, the initiative laws in our state, reproductive choice. What was the third one that you had mentioned?
Well, I said we do it through the initiative petition.
Okay.
It's education, healthcare, and incarceration.
Okay.
And specifically at this time, my focus is on the educational quality in East Oklahoma City, which is so bad.
Okay.
If you look at the income of those students that fare so poorly, without change in education, their lives won't change.
You've been known to help young people with their college tuition.
I'm a real believer in it.
And I've heard multiple stories about that. So clearly, you not only talk about it, but you actually lead by example in doing that.
Well, my attitude is this. I've been very fortunate, and it's because of all my associates that are so committed to BancFirst, to our communities in Oklahoma, that I had a choice. I enjoy art. I could have purchased art, but I'd rather invested in human capital and see people have opportunity than to adorn my walls with something that I looked at occasionally.
So if you look at your series of accomplishments, if you were to kind of reflect on what you're most proud of that you've accomplished outside of creating BancFirst, what would be your greatest accomplishment?
Easy. My children and my grandchildren.
And I think that is a testament to who you are at your core, that recognizing the importance of investing in family and in our community is critical to the future success of our state. Well,
I've come back to your reference as you looked at Oklahoma Pride. I really view myself as a direct relative of Tom Joad, and humility is so important, and understanding of how fortunate many of us are, and how obligated we should be to reach those who have not had our success.
Well, that's a great way to end our Inside the 1581. Gene, anything else you want to share with us?
Let's change Oklahoma.
Let's change Oklahoma. Very good. We've enjoyed this conversation with Gene Rainbolt, who is the founder of BancFirst. But more importantly, he has been someone who's been recognized in our state, both as a path maker, but certainly an icon and a conscience to the state of Oklahoma. And we appreciate you spending the time with us today. So as we wrap up, I want to thank you again for joining us for this edition of Inside the 1581, and I hope you enjoyed our episode. So before we go, again, we want to give a shout out to a couple really important people, as well as our partners at PYA. Alex Taylor, who is the producer of Inside the 1581, and Susie Wallace, who is the Director of Communications here at the Oklahoma Hospital Association, that really pulls all of this together. And for our listeners, to remind you again, Inside the 1581, it was just a concoction of, what could we call our podcast? And we looked at our state and we realized we have 1,581 miles of border, and we wanted to take the opportunity to tell the story within that boundary. And so we do that every other week, and we do it also with the music track. And we want to remind you again, that music track is Gunslinger by Ends of the Earth, and we appreciate the opportunity to use their music as our open and closing to every edition of Inside the 1581. So join us again in 2 weeks when we drop our next episode. Again, Gene, thanks for spending time with us. We appreciate it.
And Alex and Susie, thank you for editing, because my experience is that's what determines the outcome.
Very good. All right. Thank you, folks, and we look forward to connecting with you again.